Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafwai. The assassination of key figures in Syria left no speculation as to who had carried out the deaths. No finger-pointing on the deaths of the three key Syrian government officials. The FSA, the Free Syrian Army as they're called, a foreign-backed opposition group, claimed responsibility for this bloody massacre, which forced major powers to postpone a Western-backed UK-circulated UN vote. And regarding the UN, for the first time at the UN, in what was called a showdown, both Russia and China, two major world powers, vetoed, again, a Western-drafted resolution calling for sanctions involving Chapter 7, which involves military intervention. Well, in this news analysis, we will discuss what options are left for the West and how Assad and his security apparatus, along with his new defense chief, will handle the situation from this point on.
Votos en contra.
Those against,
Sírvanse levantar la mano.
please raise your hand. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative votes of permanent members of the Council.
The same hands go up again for the third time in 9 months against an anti-Syria UN Security Council resolution. Moscow and Beijing once again stand up for Damascus, blocking a draft resolution that could have paved the way for a Libya-style military intervention in Syria. The two permanent members of the Council say the draft was biased and failed to address the violence committed by anti-Syrian armed groups.
The draft which was just voted on was biased. The threats of sanctions were leveled exclusively at the government of Syria. This runs counter to the spirit of the Geneva document and does not reflect the realities in the country.
This draft resolution fundamentally violated the consensus reached at the Geneva meeting and has seriously disrupted the new round of mediation efforts made by Joint Special Envoy Annan.
The U.S. ambassador to the UN responded to the comments with anger, accusing Russia and China of preventing the Council from shouldering its responsibilities.
We will intensify our work with a diverse range of partners outside the Security Council to bring pressure to bear on the Assad regime and to deliver assistance to those in need.
The meeting came a day after a terrorist bomb blast rocked the Syrian capital, killing 3 high-ranking officials. The foreign-backed militant group calling itself the Free Syrian Army has claimed responsibility for the incident. But there is no word of condemnation yet by the US, Britain, France and their regional allies. In a coordinated move, Syrian opposition groups have described the incident as, quote, the beginning of the end for President Bashar al-Assad's government. But many analysts believe such claims are mere propaganda.
I don't think any terrorism operation can let a regime like the Syrian one be collapsed. The Syrian regime still have a lot of strong assets, like the armed forces, which still united.
The anti-government armed gangs that receive money, logistics support and weapons from some Western countries and their regional allies like Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey have pledged to escalate the violence in Syria. With today's blow to their supporters at the UN, it seems Syria has to brace itself for more fighting and acts of terror in the coming days.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the News Analysis, Senior Associate at St. Anthony's College from Oxford University, Sharmeen Narwani, joins us from Beirut. We have Lawrence Freeman from the Executive Intelligence Review joining us from Washington. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Lawrence Freeman. The third double veto in 9 months against an anti-Syria UN Security Council resolution. What do you make of Russia and China's veto?
Russia and China, especially Russia, has made clear all along that they are not going to support another Western military regime change policy. After Libya, when we used NATO to overthrow the regime, and then under orders from President Obama and Sarkozy in Cameroon, we ordered the assassination of the leader of Libya, the Russians in particular realized that this policy of overturning sovereign nations is also going to be aimed at them. And China has a similar concern. So they are going to fight this out not because of any immediate interest in Syria per se, although they have one, but because of the larger principle of stopping this policy which came from the former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, that we can go in and carry out regime change under the responsibility to protect anytime the West decides. The Russians have put down their foot and said, "Niet, we will not allow this once again." And that is the only thing that has prevented us from going into major war.
Well, let's look, Sharmeen Arwani, at whether that is the only reason why Russia voiced in form of a veto at the UN. It was very interesting when they said that there's a geopolitical battle that is being fought in Syria and that it's all about Iran, saying that after the United States went into Iraq and after that Iran gained power in the region, that this is basically, Russia said, if you ask any of these member countries, are going to agree with on that. What do you make of that statement?
I think we all know that Iran is a fundamental reason why the United States, the 3 permanent Security Council members who are spoilers in this, and other countries in the region are focused so heavily on Syria and pushing regime change there. For Russia, if your question is specifically about Russia, I would say that Russia, like a lot of other countries in the developing world and the major emerging economies, are concerned about certainly what the gentleman earlier said, but we're seeing a shift in the balance of power globally, partly because of the global financial and economic crisis. But also BRIC countries, for instance, and others have not had a seat at the main table in global institutions for far too long, and I think they're demanding a say. They're demanding the right to redress this global imbalance in power, and Syria has become a frontline battle for that. But beyond that, there are other issues. Certainly, the radicalization of the violence in Syria threatens to spill over broadly into the region, and certainly that is of concern to Russia and Iran and other regional players who have seen, time and time again, the growth of Salafist groups and other militant groups operating on their territory. So there's a wide variety of reasons, but certainly the geopolitical ones are very valid.
Let me bring in Rania Masri from Cairo, from the United Nations Development Program, to get her insight upon this. Rania Masri, since you are from the United Nations Development Program, tell us, based on the spirit of what the UN is, and this is in no way to talk down the UN, but are they acting as a unified group, A, and B, just their conduct, given the rhetoric coming out of different countries on the situation that's occurring in Syria? What has been your reaction of what transpired with the 2 vetoes coming from Russia and China?
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of the United Nations. I can only speak on behalf of the United Nations Development Program and the work that we have been doing with Syria. But I want to step back a moment and recognize the situation that we're in. All too often, people think that we're facing a binary situation here, which is we either have to stick with this regime, which we know has caused serious grievances amongst people, or we have another choice, which is a possibility of anarchy and disruption within the community. What we have now has happened in Syria since the beginning of the crisis until now, because of the sanctions that have been imposed on Syria and because of the violent conflict that has been imposed on Syria, both by the government and by the opposition factors. What we have had happen as a consequence of all this is a dramatic rise in poverty for middle income and poor income communities throughout Syria, with specific focus in the real conflict zones in Syria. So if we are trying to take the country forward, and I say we here, allegedly the United Nations, and most importantly the Syrians themselves, if the objective is to take the country forward, to take the country toward a democratic position, to take the country toward a really developmental, just solution, then the questions that we all need to face is how can we get there peacefully? What kind of peaceful transition can be had? Right now, when we look at what happened in the UN Security Council with this push for additional sanctions, and when we take that push and we add it on to what has already happened in Syria, In one way, let me rephrase it and put it this way. What we already know has happened is that sanctions already have caused dramatic impact on Syria's economy and on the livelihoods of millions of people in Syria, as well as in no way are we diminishing the loss of life that has happened, the tens of thousands of people who have been killed on all sides of the conflict in Syria. So again, then, the real question becomes, how can we take this forward through a peaceful transition? What possibilities does Kofi Annan's proposal have now, given how numerous different parties within the United Nations are no longer backing him? How can we strengthen that proposal? How can we move the country forward toward a peaceful transition?
Are those countries like the United States and the UK, for example, interested in that?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing anything.
Let me repeat myself, Rania Masri. When we talk about it, well, I'm
not hearing anything at all.
Lawrence Freeman. Lawrence Freeman, we heard from Rania Masri there. Are countries even in that sphere of being interested in some of the parameters that our guests there from Cairo talked about? I mean, we look at what Russia and China have done, being, in a sense, condemned about their veto, but I mean, what is happening is that they're standing up, trying to, well, let's make a point of reference to Kofi Annan's plan to work, but yet this is how the U.S. is reacting by saying, well, we're going to, what was Susan Rice's word? The U.S. will not pin its policy on the UN observer mission. Instead, we will intensify our work outside the Security Council to place pressure on Assad. Is that a way to move forward? And what does that mean when she says that?
You've hit the point correctly. And the previous representative of the UN, from the UN Development Program in Cairo made it very clear. There is not really a desire, and we should be clear about it. There is not a desire by the United States through Susan Rice or the British to actually resolve the problem, to move forward, to find a peaceful way. You have an opposition which has originally support from the people. It's been heavily aided and funded by people from the U.S. clandestine operation, the British, the Turkish, and other terrorist groups. So you don't want to have terrorists running your country. This is a regime change policy, and the U.S. said, as you quoted Susan Rice, they're not interested in finding a solution. What they gave to the Russians was, you have to agree with us that Assad has to go, that he has to stop protecting his troops. The other side can use all the firepower they want, and he has to be removed for the process to move forward. That's not an American policy. That's not the policy that I or my organization would support, or any good American would support. They're going for regime change in the area, and the previous speakers were correct. This is tied to the Operation Iran for a destabilization. But as I said earlier, it also goes beyond that, because NATO has agreed to set up anti-ballistic missile sites that can be used against Russia, and there's an encirclement policy against China in the sea outside the China continent. And these two countries realize that they are also targets of potential regime change if they give in to this British financial American system, which, by the way, is right now collapsing at an accelerating rate, which is why you have the escalation towards war. So the U.S. has no policy, has no vision for the future or the help of the Syrian people. They're going for Tony Blair's regime change policy. And by the way, Tony Blair, the author of this policy back in the 90s, is now an advisor to President Obama. So Obama now is adding another country to the list of countries he's going to overthrow if, in fact, he's successful. And Russia and China are correctly holding the line, along with the U.S. military in the United States. The Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Dempsey, has been extremely cautious on advising people not to rush into this situation. And that's been the most significant anti-regime change voice in the United States that we have seen so far.
Well, let's see to what extent this has gone. Rania Masri, since we have you back, I'd like to ask you this question. When we look at what happened yesterday in Damascus, there's no finger pointing anymore. The Free Syrian Army has claimed responsibility for what occurred. Now, in this case, does that make it okay when Susan Rice, the UN ambassador, comes out from the U.S. and says that we will do anything outside the parameters of the UN? Is this one of the things that she's referring to? Does it make it okay to have one of the leading so-called world powers to be leading such a move?
Well, I mean, of course, I'm sure that you and the listeners all know the answer to that question. The legitimacy of representation must fall to the people themselves. No one outside of the Syrian people have the right to declare who should rule the country or how that rule should be done. So clearly, when there are factors outside of Syria calling for a particular regime change, calling for a particular government, of course, that lacks legitimacy. But the question I believe that we should all be focusing on, more importantly than the position of the United States, which we're familiar with, or the position of Iran, or the position of Russia, which we're familiar with, is what assistance can be provided for the Syrians so that the Syrian people themselves have the loudest and cleanest voice in determining their own nation's pathway, and in determining that pathway through as peaceful a peaceful method as possible. And it is through here that we at the United Nations Development Programme are trying to provide some analysis and some assistance, because what we have managed to do is actually do on-the-ground investigative research as to what has been the impact of the sanctions and the violent conflict on the socioeconomic status of the Syrian people throughout the Syrian nation. And this is new, it hasn't been done yet. There's been numbers that had been presented previously, but none in such a comprehensive and statistical method as the report that we will be publishing soon. And the numbers are quite startling. When we take into consideration that we're simply talking about sanctions themselves, we managed to separate between sanctions and the violence itself. And here, I'm not specifying who's doing what, I'm simply looking at what has been the impact on the Syrian population. The sanctions themselves have dramatically increased the level of poverty. The sanctions themselves have really caused a risk to the educational status and the health status throughout the country, with particular focus on the areas that have been facing the most violent conflict itself. So when we take that into consideration, and then when we take into consideration that there are calls from other nations, the United States, France, England, and so on, calling for additional sanctions, then the perspective of all of the individuals and all of the communities in the world who are most concerned with human rights, most concerned with civil rights, most concerned with the rights of the Syrian people themselves, here is where I think we need to be most worrisome. Additional sanctions on Syria will cause additional hardship on the Syrian population. And sanctions themselves have been proven, whether we look at the case of Iraq, or whether we look at the case of Burma, we look at numerous cases around the world, sanctions have proven to be an ineffective method at political change. They've proven to be ineffective at political change, regardless of their legitimacy or illegitimacy. They have proven to be effective in causing hardships to the population. And again, if the objective of concerned populations is making sure that the socioeconomic status of the Syrian people is high and gets empowered, and that the Syrian people themselves are empowered to make the decisions that they need to make, and those decisions be made through as peaceful a process as possible, therein we need to be working to make sure that that pathway is workable. What's interesting, by the way, is there's a conference that is planned in Syria at the end of the month, a conference that is trying to break this binary of either we stand with the regime or either we stand with the Free Syrian Army and certain members of the opposition that are using violence. It's a conference entitled Building the Syrian State, Saving the Syrian Homeland, and it's a conference that's open for all Syrians. It's not one that's endorsed by the United Nations. I'm not speaking here as the UN. I'm simply pointing out that there are third measures that are being attempted within Syria, third measures that are being attempted within numerous political parties and within numerous opposition and the regime itself, third measures to try to arrive at a peaceful solution out of this anarchy and this hellish situation that we find in Syria right now.
And of course, we just recently had the unilateral sanctions that were imposed by the EU and by the United States. Let's see here. Sharmin Narwani, I'd like to break this into three and find out what's next here. What is, first of all, going to be the moves that the U.S. is going to make, based on your opinion, along with their partners? And then the next two groups are going to be, obviously, the opposition on the ground. And, of course, we're then looking at what Russia is going to do. But first, to you, regarding the next move by the U.S. and its partners regarding Syria. Sharmin Narwani.
Yeah, well, there was a period a few months back that it looked like the U.S. and its partners were actually, by and large, taking a step back and looking for an exit strategy, because you had the French presidential election, the U.S. presidential elections coming up later this year, and I think Syria was becoming too cumbersome an issue. Something clearly changed. They're back in the game. Losing, a vote a third time at the Security Council, I think now the questions about whether Russia or China can be swayed to move away from their existing position on Syria has, if it's not clear to the US, France, and UK, there's something wrong with them. So I think we might see the US take a step back. Having seen that, in fact, with the escalation of violence, Russia's position and China's position becomes firmer. So we might see that. I mean, we have a U.S. presidential election coming up in a few months.
Right.
That will be part of the consideration.
Let me jump in quickly since we're running quickly out of time. Lawrence Freeman, Russia's position, we heard about that phone conversation that was initiated by President Obama to Vladimir Putin. Of which there were some agreements on the issue, but still differences remain. What agreements could there be, and what are the differences?
Well, Putin has made very clear from discussions he's had with President Obama, and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has made very clear that they will not support a regime change policy, and they will not support a policy that begins first with the removal of President Assad Bashir. And that is unmistakable, and this previous speaker is correct if they don't understand it by now. And so therefore, we could look for what we saw in other cases where the United States looks for so-called other allies, which will be the British first, to actually move around the UN, skip the UN, violate the UN, and move on their own for a so-called coalition of the willing. I think your guest from Cairo is absolutely right. If we're not putting forth a policy for economic development, for uplifting the people's quality of life, for jobs, for food, for energy, then what is the policy of the United States? And clearly that is essential if you really want to remove the underlying causes for the whole Arab Spring, going back to Tunisia and Egypt, the question of food and the mobility of life and having a decent potential for your family in the future are essential. And we don't address those situations, and she's right, the sanctions should never have been put on, they should be removed.
Okay, let me bring in Rania Masri now to get her final word on this. Rania Masri, you heard our guest there, Lawrence Freeman. So is that the last option in a sense? And if that is to be executed, based on what you said and what our guest there agreed with you on, I think there's going to be a problem when it comes to the opposition, such as the Free Syrian Army on the ground, that perhaps is not going to let this happen. Do you see that? And is that the option that perhaps, at least to help the Syrian people, to happen actually? Rania Masri.
I'm sorry, the audio system is not that clear. Could you repeat the question?
Basically, the option that you laid out, were to be executed, since the UN has failed in what we saw today, isn't it going to be met with opposition, with the so-called opposition on the ground, where they are on this, what do they call this, a full assault on Damascus by the name of Damascus volcano and earthquakes of Syria? Isn't that going to be a problem?
Yes, dialogue is a problem when you have extremists on both sides that are not willing to dialogue. Yes, it is most definitely a problem. However, I firmly believe that there are also individuals and political parties and communities on both sides of this crisis that are willing to dialogue and that are not willing to have their homeland and their nation destroyed any further. And it is this that needs to be the starting point. There are such ministers within the Syrian government, such as Dr. Ali Haidar, the Minister of National Reconciliation, and there are such internal opposition and members of the external opposition within Syria that also want to see a pathway that is not based upon burning Syria. Now, how much power will they have? That's unknown. How much power can they be given? That's unknown. But I think there's one point that I want to add in reference to the earlier speaker. To be able to say that the Arab Spring, quote unquote, was a consequence of economic deprivation alone is not just. particularly in Syria, but also when we look at throughout the region, yes, there has been economic deprivation, but when we look at Syria, that has not been the primary cause for the first protest that erupted in Syria more than a year ago. We cannot separate the need for the people to be both have both economic equity and economic justice and political equity and political
Sharmeen
representation.
Narwani from Beirut and Lawrence Freeman from Washington. And from Kaveh Taghweh and the entire team is goodbye from the capital, Tehran.